Please stand by.
Good morning. The time now 8 a.m. On the April 26, 2024, Friday in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo office morning seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce the latest World Bank publications. Every April and October, the respective regional chief economist offices of the World Bank publish the regional economic update of the respective regions to summarize the economic outlook and future perspectives, and also the deep analysis on key topics related to the regions. This morning, we are going to feature the Africa Regional Economic Update, which is titled Africa's Pulse, April 2024 edition, titled Tackling Inequality is Necessary for Growth and Poverty Reduction. With us today, connecting from Washington, we have Cesar Calderon, who is the lead economist in the office of the chief economist for the Africa region of the World Bank. For the next 18 months, towards the next round of the Tokyo International Conference for African Development, TICAD, which is going to be held at the end of August next year, we'll try to feature the report publications related to Africa as much as we can. So the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to listen to Cesar summarizing the latest edition of the Africa's Pulse. And after his presentation, as usual, I will read the questions that we received from you. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your question by the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. So I'll read your questions on your behalf, asking Cesar to respond. So with that, I'd like to formally invite Cesar to come in to kick off and start your presentation. Cesar, please come in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koichi. I'm glad to participate again in the Tokyo morning seminars. And I'm going to share my presentation. Hope that you can see it in your screen.
Yes, we can see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. We're going good morning to everybody in Tokyo. I'm glad to be again here presenting the main findings of the regional economic outlook of the Africa region, the Africa's Pulse. The special topic of this issue has to do with inequality, and more specifically with the structural inequalities and how policymakers need to address these structural inequalities in order to not only boost growth, but also accelerate poverty reduction in the region. What happened? Did the screen disappear? No. Okay.
Actually, I don't now see your PowerPoint, so perhaps.
Okay, let me see. Maybe there was I'm going to try to share it again, and I'm going to try to go faster. Okay. So first, let's start with the good news, but with a nuance. The good news is that GDP growth in the Africa region appears to have bottomed out in 2023. No?
Cesar, sorry, you may want to put it in full screen mode.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Super. Thank you.
So the good news is that economic activity has bottomed out. economic growth is rebounding in Africa. However, the rebound is still tepid and fragile, right? Economic growth in Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to rebound from 2.6% in 2023 to 3.4% in 2024 and 3.8% in 2025. And as you can see in the first graph in the left, this rebound in growth was primarily driven by a recovery in consumption. The contribution of consumption to GDP growth nearly almost doubles from 2023 to 2024. And one of the reasons why, and we're going to talk all the reasons why we observe this rebound in the region, is because inflation is cooling. On the production side, sorry, let's continue with the expenditure side. As we said, there is a doubling in the contribution of consumption. On the other hand, the contribution of investment remains relatively stable, although it has declined a little bit, and that has to do with interest rates being higher, whereas the contribution of government spending, which is government consumption, which is this red part of the bar, is very small, and this has a correlate with the fact that African countries are fiscally consolidated. On the production side, we see that growth in the region or recovery in the region is mostly driven by services and to a lesser extent a pickup in industry. However, as you know very well in many of these presentations, the growth performance in the region is very heterogeneous. It differs. The pace of growth differs across countries. For instance, one of the recent features of regional growth is that the level is low, the rate is low because it's being dragged by the growth performance of the large countries. As we saw in the previous slide, growth in the region is expected to be 3.4% in 2024. If we exclude the bigger countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola, that growth becomes 4.4%. Also, Eastern and Southern Africa tends to grow at a slower pace than Western and Central. For instance, in Eastern and Southern Africa is expected to accelerate growth to 3.2% in 2024, whereas in the West, growth is going to be 3.7%. There are pockets of growth in the region that are pockets of fast growth in the region. For instance, within the Eastern and Southern Africa, we can highlight the growth performance of the Eastern African community, and that is expected to grow above 5%, 5.3% in 2024. And this is because of the good performance of countries like Rwanda, Uganda, DRC, and Kenya. In the West, on the other hand, you have the WAMU, the West African Monetary and Economic and Monetary Union, that is expected to grow at a rate of 5.9% in 2024. And of course, one can highlight the good performance of countries like Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, and Senegal. So we have good news. There is a rebound, and there are some pockets of high growth in the region. Now, here comes the core of the macro story in this presentation, which is what is driving this growth recovery. So we're going to look at drivers that are enabling the recovery and drivers that are mitigating or deterring growth. As I said before, the first factor that we look at is inflation. Inflation has been declining in the region. If you look at 2024, inflation is expected to be at 5.1%, the median inflation of the region at 5.1%, which is 2 percentage points lower than what it was in 2023, and more than 4 percentage points lower than the peak in 2022. No? What drives this reduction, this deceleration in inflation? Normalization of global supply chains is one driver. A steady decline in commodity prices since they hit peaks in the second quarter of 2022. And the impact of monetary tightening and fiscal consolidation in some African countries. No? We know that inflation is receding, and is receding in most countries in the region. However, the median inflation in 2024 is still, for the region, is still higher than the pre-pandemic levels. No? The graph on the right also shows a little bit the improvement in terms of inflation reduction. For instance, the number of countries with low inflation, which is this green bar, had a minimum of 9, reached a minimum of 9 in 2022. Only 9 countries in the region, 9 out of 48, had an inflationary rate below 5%. However, that number has increased to 23 in 2024, which means that there are more countries in the region that are registering low growth rates. I mean, however, the other part of the story is that there are still countries in the region with high inflation, with 2 digits or with inflation rates of 2 digits or more. And this is the red column. It has been coming down, but very slowly, and we still have 13 countries in the region that have 2-digit plus inflation, and that number is coming down from a peak of 19 countries in 2022. Okay, so we can distinguish within the region 2 different groups: a group of countries that are converging towards their target inflation, towards their targeted inflation, although they're still above pre-pandemic, they're still above the target, and they're still above pre-pandemic levels. And there are countries where you still have serious inflationary problems. And that means that the response in terms of monetary policy might be different. The first group of countries might be more prone towards putting a pause on the hiking cycle. And the second group of countries still need to implement contractionary monetary and fiscal policies to try to fight inflation. Okay. Now, the story of inflation in Africa is still driven by whatever is happening with food prices and with currencies. For instance, in 2020, in 2022, 2023, where inflation was still high, was still very high in most countries. It was food prices and weaker currencies that end up explaining the high inflation. Now, in 2024, domestic inflation has been on the retreat across most countries. However, it has been, the problem is that domestic food inflation, domestic prices of food have been declining at a slower rate than international food prices. No? And we still have, if we look at this graph in the left, we still have at least 12 to 14 countries where food inflation is still 2 digits or more. Okay. In the case of, and of course, in some of the countries that still have high very fast food inflation are Ethiopia, Nigeria, Malawi, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe. These countries are here, right? In the case of currencies, again, we also see, if we look at the green bars, we observe that there's a lot of currencies in the region that had a depreciation of more than 10%. No, the cases that stand out are Nigeria, Angola, Malawi, and South Sudan, with depreciations of year to date in 2023 of more than 30%. No, and part of the weakening of the currencies in sub-Saharan Africa is the result of tighter financial conditions and a very strong dollar. No? However, in 2024, most currencies in the region are stabilizing. You can see that with the red diamond. No? Most currencies, and in some cases, like in the case of the Kenyan shilling, they have managed to revert the direction of variation in the real exchange rate. In the case of the Kenyan shilling, information up to mid-April shows that the Kenyan shilling has appreciated by around 16-17% so far this year. And that, to some extent, is attributed to the fact that the Central Bank of Kenya increased monetary policy rates to defend the currency. And on the other hand, that the uncertainty around the Eurobond bullet payment that the government had to do was resolved. The second factor that might explain the recovery or might enable the recovery is certain optimism on the global economy. No? Global activity remained resilient in the second half of 2023, thanks to strong private and public consumption that sustained aggregate demand in spite of the fact that financial conditions were tight. So this is we have seen, especially in advanced countries and in some advanced countries, particularly the US, and in some large emerging markets, we have seen greater participation of labor force, normalization of supply chains, and falling energy and commodity prices that are contributing to global activity, becoming resilient, in spite of the fact that there's still a lot of geopolitical tensions and the fact that there is geoeconomic fragmentation too. Now, still, the global economy is still not out of the woods, and there might be some growth headwinds that may happen ahead this year. But again, we still don't know. The graph on the right depicts the inflation situation. Again, we show that inflation is coming down for most advanced countries and for most emerging markets with inflation targeting frameworks. However, the inflationary rate is still above target, and the last mile to tame inflation is proving very challenging. This implies that this stubborn inflation implies that the interest rates may remain higher for a longer period, especially in the United States, where probability of having 3 rate cuts or having the first rate cut by the end of the second quarter have vanished, and now the market is pricing only 1 price cut by the end of the year. A third factor that can, to some extent, also explain the recovery is the fact that fiscal deficits are coming down, but are coming down very slowly. We can observe in the first graph the median fiscal balance in sub-Saharan Africa, and we observe that it has a modest decline from a deficit of 3.8% in 2023 to just 3.5% in 2024. And another way to look at it, and this is happening within a context where consolidation measures are being implemented in the region. You have tax administration and compliance measures, tax reforms, the streamlining of tax expenditures, subsidy reforms, and repurposing of public expenditures towards growth-enhancing programs. These programs are evolving, and hopefully, we're going to see better results in these years to come. Now, another way to look at the fact that this deficit is slow is the fact that the number of countries with a large deficit, defined here by a deficit higher than 3% of GDP, is declining, but is declining slowly. So this is the red bar that you can see in the right graph, in the graph on the right, where the number of countries with with large deficits peaked in 2022 at 34 countries, and it has been declining slowly towards 27 countries in 2024. Now, the fact that fiscal balance, the fiscal adjustment is relatively slow, may have helped not to take all the momentum of the recovery. Now, and again, as I was saying before, a mix of measures boosting revenues and reining in spending is explaining the improvement in the fiscal balance. In this graph, what we have is the countries where the fiscal balance has improved or is expected to improve in 2024 vis-a-vis 2023. And for instance, the green bar looks at the variation in government revenues, and the yellow bar, the variation in government expenditure. So for instance, let me look at the case of, let's say, Rwanda, with this bar here. In the case of Rwanda, there is an improvement of almost 2 percentage points of GDP, I think, during the 2024. However, most of the contribution comes from reining in spending rather than expanding taxation. Whereas in the case of, let's say, Guinea-Bissau or Sierra Leone, you have an improvement in the fiscal balance, but most of the contribution is coming from increasing revenues, which is this green bar. So again, the contribution of, let's say, increased revenues or lowering spending to improve fiscal balances is very heterogeneous, as you can see across countries in the region, across the countries that really experience an improvement in their fiscal balance. Now we're going to talk about the disablers. What are the factors that are driving this fragility in the recovery? Okay. So the first one is debt service and liquidity pressures remaining severe in the region. As you all know, more than half of African governments are currently grappling with external liquidity problems. They're facing unsustainable debt burdens, or they're very proactively seeking for restructure or reprofiling of their debt. In a context where the landscape of creditors have changed, and African countries are now resorting more to getting indebted with non-party club governments, or resorting to market financing, public debt service obligations have ballooned. They have increased significantly. For instance, if we look at the graph on the left, we see that the debt service burden, so this is amortization, the payment of the loan principal plus interest rates, has increased from 31% of government revenues to 47% in 1 year. 31% in 2022, 47% in 2023. And the high levels of these high levels of debt service, of course, are adversely affecting the fiscal space of many countries in the region and increasing their vulnerability to shocks, especially for countries in the region that have gained access to international bond markets or other non-concessional financing sources. Those are the ones that are more affected. At the same time, one of the reasons why we have this big jump in debt service has to do with the fact that the debt service suspension initiative, also called DSSI, expire at the end of 2021 and resulted in more or less an increase in debt service of around $51 billion by the end of 2023 for African countries. No? Now, this higher debt service is taking place in a context where the gross financing needs of the government remains very high. If you take a look at, for instance, the period 2012 to 2019, the average gross financing needs of African governments were about 6% of GDP. Now we're talking about double digits, and most of the gross financing needs are basically due to higher debt services. And this includes not only external debt, which is this part of the bar that is the dark green, but also refinancing of large domestic debt service, which is the light green part. And the problem is that the domestic debt refinancing of domestic debt service is that the debt service, the domestic debt, sorry, is shorter in maturity than the external debt. So there is always a risk of debt rollover. Okay. Now, as I said before, the risk of the risk of external debt distress in sub-Saharan Africa remains high. So imagine a region that had only, and this is the classification of low-income countries with the sustainability framework in sub-Saharan Africa, which is around 37, 38 countries. And the share of countries that are already in high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress, which is the sum of these red and gray bars. So this share has increased from approximately 27% in 2015 to 53% in 2023. So you see the share of countries in already in high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress has almost doubled in the last 8 years. No? And this is happening again in an environment where these low-income countries with DSF are resorting more and more on domestic. No? The problem is many of these countries have low tax collection, and in order to finance their fiscal deficits, they have to resort to domestic debt, given that in most cases, many of these countries are priced out of international markets, bilateral lending kind of like dried up immediately in the immediate post-COVID period. No. So, for instance, if I can give you an idea of how much domestic debt has increased in these countries in the region, in the low-income countries in the region, it has increased from 8.5% in 2012 to, so here, like 8.5% in 2012 to around 20.7% in 2023. So we're talking about domestic debt that has, as a percentage of GDP, that has more than doubled over the last 10, 11 years. So one of the disablers or the mitigators that we were talking about was the high debt burden. Another one is that the funding is drying up. The external resources in the region are drying up, and whatever countries can get in terms of funding is more expensive. Many countries in the region, because of the high levels of external debt payments, many countries in the region are facing temporary external liquidity pressures both in 2024 and in 2025. And this is taking place in a context where, if you watch the graph on the left, many of the external financing flows, whether they're public or private, are shrinking. particularly FDI, which is this yellow line. Loan disbursement from China have been declining since 2016. Same thing with international bond issuances, of course, have been also declining, and they were very minimal during the COVID years. And when we think about private flows, we observe, as I said before, the decline in FDI. Another way to look at the external liquidity shortages in the region is by looking at net debt flows. And what we observe is that if we compare 2019 or 2018, the years, or 2017 to 2019, like the 3 years before COVID, with the years that came afterwards, 2020, 21, and 22, we observe that there is a significant decline in net debt flows to the Africa region, whether they were private or they were public. The public is the light green, and we're going to observe that, of course, the net debt flows in these 3 years are much lower than the ones in the 3 years prior to the COVID pandemic. And that means pretty much that amortizations are growing in the region at a faster rate than disbursement. So as you can see, this group of countries, at least in the region, they have a dire need for fresh resources. Now, some countries in the region, like Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya, have been able to return to international capital markets this year, either to buy back and refinance Eurobonds or any other commercial loan that is falling due. However, the big problem is that financing has come at a higher rate. To give you an example, in February, Kenya made a $1.5 billion issuance of a Eurobond, and the coupon rate was around 9.75. The coupon rate of the Eurobond that they were replacing, which is the Eurobond that was falling due in 2024, was between 6.5 and 7%. So you can see that it was more expensive. Now, what can countries do? What is the step forward? Well, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later. Countries need to increase domestic resource mobilization. That is critical, so they can win back some policy space and channel resources towards more pro-growth public spending and addressing debt rollover risks. That's on the one hand. But the international community can also play a role by trying to provide more concessional financing that can facilitate the implementation of structural reforms for these countries and also support external debt management. Now, the third factor that is deterring a speedier recovery in the region is conflict and violence. Conflict and violence remains elevated, and they're weighing on economic activity, as a result of whether you have geopolitical tensions within countries, think about Sudan, or within subregions, think about the ECOWAS, problems of weak institutions, and cost of living crisis. I think you may all have heard the typical statistic that is being repeated all over the place, that since the year 2000, there have been 8 successful coup d'etats in Africa West. So these military coups and this risk of coup contagion are having an adverse impact on international investor sentiment, and it's increasing the perception of risk towards the region as a whole. As you know, there are tensions. I mean, conflict and violence is spread out in the region. Unfortunately, there are tensions in West Africa that have escalated because of the decision of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to leave ECOWAS. The civil war in Sudan already turned 1 year, and the resolution of the conflict between the two different forces, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces through mediation, may prove very difficult. Conflict still continues in Ethiopia, in the Amhara region. And in the end, one of the let's say one of the pernicious collateral effects of this persistent conflict and organized violence in the region is that they may disrupt the production or access to food staples in several countries. You can think about the situation that is being lived in Burkina, Mali, Niger, Somalia, among other countries. But these food security problems are not only may not only be the outcome of persistent conflict and violence, they are also amplified by climatic shocks. No, this year you may have followed the news. This year, frequent droughts and floods in several parts of Africa, whether it's East and Southern Africa, whether hot dry weather in West Africa, are affecting the production of food. No, and recent numbers estimate that about 105 million people in the region are facing severe food insecurity by the end of March 2024. Okay, so now we come to the second section of the polls that basically talks about structural inequalities that need to be addressed in order to foster growth and reduce extreme poverty. I'll try to go a little bit faster because I realize that I'm already 36 minutes to the hour. This fragile recovery that we've been talking about in the first section is taking place on the backdrop of very weak long-term growth in the region. And this poor long-term growth is largely driven by structural imbalances, which basically limits the contribution of human capital and wealth, the accumulation of human capital and wealth to economic activity. As a result, this limited growth that we were observing in the region in recent decades have been very ineffective at reducing poverty. So there's this big urgency to revitalize growth in the region. I mean, you can see the graph on the left, the growth per capita in the region over the last 10, 11 years, from 2015 to 2026. Now, if we compare that to the average, the last growth spell in the region from 2000 to 2014, you can see that the growth rate in any of these years over the last 10, 11 years can exceed the 2.4% that the region managed to record in 2014. Now, if you take an average of the growth rate of all these 11 years, growth per capita has not grown in sub-Saharan Africa, which basically leads to the idea that this continent is basically is entering into a decade of growth futility. One of the reasons why we cannot observe high growth in the region is not only the fact that growth in the region is slower because the region is exposed to many shocks. They don't have enough risk management tools to address these shocks. They are exposed to commodity prices, political uncertainty, lack of investment, and lack of diverse exports. No? Those factors basically tend to not only lower the rate of growth, but also increase its volatility. And these factors also explain the fact that the region is unable to sustain growth. If you look at this graph on the right, we look at the duration of expansions in economic activity vis-a-vis the depth or the pace of that expansion, which basically tells you within an expansion episode how much GDP per capita grow per year. So, for instance, if we compare Africa, which is the green bar, with East Asia, which is emerging East Asia, which is the yellow bar, we observe that emerging East Asia grows at least 1 percentage point higher than Africa in an expansion episode per year. Now, take into account the fact that now the duration of an expansion in East Asia on average is 8 years, and in Sub-Saharan Africa is not even half of it. So this is when you compound these differences, you're going to have a huge divergence, or the evidence of a region that is falling behind. Let me go back again with this story, but let's put that story in levels. So for instance, if I look at this graph of growth per capita, and I look at the levels, you can see that after 2014, the level of growth the income per capita has been declining, and it's going to reach again the 2014 level in 2026, which means, again, what I was saying before, that the growth rate per capita in this period on average was 0% per year. Now, if the economy would have grown at the pace of 2014, which was the last growth spell in the region, then growth would have been 1/3 higher. And again, here you also see the region falling behind vis-a-vis East Asia and South Asia, regions that have not only a faster pace during the expansion, but also longer expansions. No? Now, this low and stable growth in Africa is leading not only to income losses and divergence with respect to the rest of the world, but also is having a very limited impact on poverty reduction. No? Sub-Saharan Africa stands out globally as a region with the highest extreme poverty reduction. We have estimates at 35% of people living behind the poverty line by 2019, and the next region is South Asia with only 9%. The other thing that characterizes Africa is that growth doesn't translate to lower poverty as effectively as other countries. For instance, a 1% per capita GDP growth increase is associated with only a 1% poverty reduction. Whereas in the rest of the world, that reduction is double, 2.2%. Now, what explains this poor growth elasticity of poverty? Well, let's skip this. I think this report basically says that the main thesis of this report is that inequality is underpinning both low economic growth and low responsiveness of poverty reduction too. But inequality, the other thesis of this special focus is that it's not any type of inequality. It's what we call structural inequality. No? The type of inequality that arises from differences that are outside of a person's control, like their race, gender, ethnicity, place of birth, education of their parents, etc., etc. No? So we're not talking here about differences in income or inequality because of individual talent or effort. No, we're talking about characteristics that are exogenous to the individual. No? And what we can see is that this inequality, which is basically structural inequality, which is basically shown by these orange bars, is very high. Now, another way to look at these structural inequalities these are barriers that prevent individuals from reaching their potential product. And that can happen in 3 different stages. Prior to joining the labor market, when the individual is building productive capacity. Second, when the individual joins the market, their occupational choice might be distorted by market imperfections and institutional distortions that pretty much limit private sector development and the creation of wage jobs. And third, regressive tax policies, no? that instead of redressing some of the inequalities end up exacerbating them. You know? And it's basically tax systems that are characterized by, or fiscal systems that are characterized by regressive tax policies, narrow tax bases, poorly targeted spending. You know? Okay, so I'm gonna try to go even faster. We're going to present some illustrations on these structural inequalities at these three different stages: prior to joining the market, when the individual is in the market, and the fiscal policy side. No? So the first one is that if you look at this graph here, what restricts the access to public services for children? It's almost half is explained by the location of the kid, whether it's in an urban area or a rural area or in a different region within the country. So that is one thing that basically restricts the limit of intergenerational mobility. The fact that when these kids want to start building up their productive capacity because of the location or because of the education of their parents, which you sum it is almost 73%. These kids have no access to education or health, or insufficient access to education, health, safe water and sanitation, electricity, etc., etc. Another way to look at these limitations is also in the second graph. We see the share of the 1980s cohort that managed to surpass their parents' educational category, and Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest share. The second dimension is looking at market distortions. Market distortions typically lead to resource misallocation. They limit productivity and they limit earnings. No? Where these pretty much imply these market distortions can create an unequal access to markets and inputs, which means that the most efficient firms or the most talented people are not necessarily the most profitable. No? And typically these distortions also do prevent the growth of firms and the creation of wage jobs. And a good comparison is here, where you find that small enterprises, let's say from 1 to 4 individuals working in the firm, are only 52% of the firms in the United States, whereas in Africa, that percentage goes from 80% in the case of Ghana to 92% in the case of Rwanda. No? So there's a limitation. Let me put it this way: there's a limitation to take advantage of economies of scale in these economies. And another way to look at it is looking at product market regulations. No? And what we find here is that if we compare 3 countries in the region, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa, with the OECD, product market regulations are much higher in Africa than in the OECD. No? And this is pretty much in all their categories, whether it's barriers to entrepreneurship or barriers to trade and investment or state control of economic activity. Finally, the third dimension is tax policy. No? If we can, to try to make the explanation shorter, what we find, first of all, if we look at the graph on the left and we look at Africa, we can see that, for instance, the blue ball, the blue circle, is income inequality based on market income, which is basically prior to taxes, transfers, and subsidies. And Africa has the largest degrees of inequality. Now, if we look at this black line, it tells you how much income inequality declines after you take into account taxes, transfers, and subsidies. So this black line is high, which means that there is some redistribution in Africa. Unfortunately, that redistribution is insufficient. Why? Because after taxes, transfers, and subsidies, the level of inequality in African countries continues being much higher than in countries of their same income level outside Africa. No, and another way to look at when we look at the impact of transfers and subsidies on poverty, we observe that in most cases in African countries, this black circle is positive, which means that the impact of tax policy may not help necessarily the poor, right? And that means that maybe the poor is paying more in taxes than what they receive in cash benefits. This is typically the outcome of either a very regressive taxation system, poorly targeted subsidies, and very limited social assistance to compensate the most vulnerable. And finally, the report, and I'm gonna finish here. Finally, the report provides a series of policy recommendations. I'm not gonna go through them. You can find them in the report, and the set of policies are in four different buckets. One is build macro resilience. In this case, restore macro stability, and then the other three buckets are basically categories of policies to help individuals, help leveling the playing field to individuals, so they cannot go to the labor market or they cannot build their productive capacity in disadvantage with respect to other people. So we're talking about policies that promote international mobility, those that support market access, and those that ensure fiscal progressivity. One of the main messages of these polls is that given the size of the developmental needs, given the size of inequalities, fiscal policy alone is not going to be able to redistribute income in order for these structural inequalities to be fully addressed. There's a lot of investments that need to be done, not only in terms of building productive capacity, building the human capital of kids, but also in supporting market access. Enable a labor force with the skills that match market demand, and that enable the growth of firms that can create more wage jobs. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for your deeper presentation to summarize and give us a snapshot of the latest edition of the Africa's Pulse report. We received some questions from the audience in advance, and also one question came in during your presentation. So let me read those questions and ask you to respond comprehensively. First one, would you explain the current situation of the food security challenges in Africa and their impact on the regional economic outlook? So this is the first question. The second one, the slide 17, Africa's growth has had limited impact on poverty reduction. It's very worrisome, with additional shocks caused by the pandemic, Ukraine war, and the climate change. What are the most impactful remedies to shift this trend? Infrastructure, electricity, the role of private sector, or technologies, innovations? So that's the second question. These are the questions from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question as usual. And also received a question from Fukunaga-san during the presentation. Let me read. Given the future of African economies, I believe that among the many sources of the financing, concessional borrowing from the multilateral financial institutions will become more important. What do you think about this? So those are the questions. So I would like to ask Cesar to come in to make comprehensive comments on those questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the interesting questions. Regarding food security, unfortunately, in Africa, there are three factors that are leading to food security problems. One is conflict and violence, the other one is climate shocks, and the third one is the rising cost of living because of macroeconomic problems. No? As you may see, as you may have seen, El Nino phenomenon, for instance, is creating is wreaking havoc in some countries in the region. You can see floods in, let's say, you can see floods in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia. You can see countries with severe droughts that have already declared a state of emergency, like Malawi, like Zambia. And you are also seeing like rising temperatures in South Africa to the extent that apparently, at least that's what I heard. That's what we have in terms of information. Uh, Exports of agricultural products in South Africa are going to decline. In the case of the countries that I mentioned before, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe too, that have declared a state of emergency, they're going to start importing corn in some cases for the first time. No, so the situation is complicated, and I haven't even talked about what's happening in West Africa with the dry weather and the black pot disease that is affecting the production of cocoa. If you have seen the price of cocoa in international markets, it has skyrocketed. No? So it's now above $10,000 per ton. But the problem is that farmers in the region cannot take advantage of the higher prices because the reason why these prices are so high is because there's a huge supply shortage because of the disease and the weather. No. As I said during the presentation, if you put together all these factors, around 105 million people are going to be in facing acute problems of food security. Now, there are solutions in the short term and solutions in the long term. When we think about the long term, we think about, for instance, social assistance, social protection, in-kind transfers, nutrition programs. I mean, the bank has been contributing a little bit to that in terms of, for instance, nutrition programs or facilitating the import of some food staples for some countries. Then the other type of solution is more towards the medium to long term, which basically relies on policies that improve productivity in the agricultural sector. No? And you were thinking about, investments in research and development, digital solutions, technological update, repurposing of public spending into productivity enhancing programs for agriculture. And we're thinking here extension services, water management, irrigation. I mean, those programs may help countries improve their agricultural productivity and try to reduce the risk, to some extent, the risk of food security issues. The World Bank, as you know very well, has a lot of projects in areas of agriculture, nutrition, social protection, water, and irrigation, right? So an example of that was the program that was launched in 2022, the Food Systems Resilient Program for Eastern and Southern Africa, that basically tries to help increase the resilience of food systems in countries in the region to tackle growing food insecurity. Regarding the slide 17, Africa's growth has had a limited impact on poverty reduction. Yeah, I mean, this is historical, unfortunately. And I think it's the type of growth that the Africa region has that doesn't allow poverty reduction to be faster. And by type of growth, I mean the type of growth that is, the fact that growth has been driven in the continent by extractive activities that tend to be more intensive in capital, and also the inability to create wage jobs. The question is how to remedy this trend. I mean, again, this report argues that policies in these 4 buckets that are in the last slides can help. For instance, building productive capacity. Governments need to provide better access to public services, education, health, water, electricity. They need to invest in nutrition of kids. They need to expand foundation and learning, and focus on access to services, especially on those areas that are or populations that are underserved. Second is the productive capacity that is built in the region needs to be efficiently used. No? And that means policies that foster access to markets, regulatory frameworks that put a premium on competition and innovation, and proactively engage with the private sector to encourage market access. And this is where, the FCFTA implementation and the construction of transport corridors can also play a big role. And finally, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can redress some of these inequalities. No? And we can think about taxing high net worth individuals, for instance, income taxes or property taxes, eliminating value-added tax exemptions, and try to have a more rigorous oversight of new tax expenditures, adaptive social protection, and utility reform. No? Now, the last question is the sources of financing. Yes, concessional learning will play a bigger role, definitely, because at this point, with interest rates that are higher for a longer period, it's highly likely that access to market financing is going to be very expensive to start with. So concessional lending coming from multilaterals or concessional lending coming from governments is going to be the type of resources that are needed. We don't need to have, again, the story of Africa borrowing at a more expensive rate to just pay for cheaper debt that they contracted before. And what we also need is what the region really needs is a lot of fresh resources at a concessional level that can help them boost growth, sustain growth, and at the same and that can be done by supporting structural reforms that address structural inequalities that we just mentioned in this presentation. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for responding to the question that we received from the audience. Once again, with us this morning, connecting from Washington, was the Cesar Calderon, the lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for Africa region, who presented the latest edition of the Africa's Pulse, April 2024 edition. Cesar, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Koichi. And to everyone in Tokyo, have a great day.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are going to continue our journey through different regions in terms of presenting, introducing the regional economic update. Next week, we will be featuring Latin America and the Caribbean region on the April 30th, and the Europe and Central Asia on the May the 2nd. Both online seminars will start at 8 a.m. in Japan Standard Time. Thank you very much. See you next time.